Good morning, Chairman Davis, Chairman Martin, committee members. My name is Ken Quinn, and I'm from Bridgeton, Maine, and I'm here in support of HP 1232. I'm also with U.S. term limits. And what I would like to discuss this morning is, first of all, I'd like to address the previous testimony. This is not a constitutional convention. This is only a convention, as Article 5 says, for proposing amendments. This is a process that the framers gave us to use our ability to secure our safety and security. The amendment, why have a constitution and an amending process if we're afraid to use it? And I'll just give you a little history. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but Congress has introduced 12,000 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. This is the exact same process that Congress takes advantage of every single day they meet virtually. The states have never introduced a single amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and the framers gave us this mechanism precisely for the situation we find ourselves in today. We have a government that is dysfunctional. We have politicians who are elderly. Recently, there are 3 major bills held up because they were in the hospital due to health issues. We have $20 trillion in debt. They are kicking the can down the road because they're afraid to take on the tough issues, and it's time we get some fresh ideas in Washington. We cannot do that unless we get new people down there, and this whole process allows open elections, fair elections, to give us more choices at the ballot box so that we can get better people representing us. The state of Maine, in 1996, the people voted by 59% on initiative, question number 1, to put term limits on their congressional members. 5 provisions in that initiative were to do that. The number 1 provision of that initiative was to instruct the state legislature to call an Article 5 convention to propose this amendment. That was the will of the people of Maine in 1996. 6 months ago, a survey was taken by the McLaughlin Associates here in Maine, and over 2/3 of the voters in Maine want term limits on Congress. 67% of them want their state legislature and state legislators to vote for this resolution to propose an amendment to the Constitution for term limits on Congress. The American people, this is the one issue that goes across party lines. It crosses gender, income levels, race. The American people have been wanting this for decades, and it's time that we finally do what they want. Folks, the office in Congress was never meant to be held for life. And I would say most of us would agree and find comfort that the 22nd Amendment limits the President of the United States. If the executive is limited to terms, why not the very ones who create the laws be limited to terms? You experience term limits here in Maine. And it's time that we put an end to the political career politicians, the incumbent party, which refuses to do the will of the people, and we allow other people the opportunity to do the work of the citizens of the United States. And all I'm asking for you today is that our nation deserves to have a conversation. All this process is a meeting. It's nothing to fear. We have a long history of conventions amongst the states dealing with issues. In fact, one takes place every single year that the state of Maine sends commissioners every year. It's called the Uniform Law Commission. The process is virtually identical. They draft, debate, produce uniform state laws that then have to come back and be passed by you as a legislature before they're enacted. So this is nothing to fear, and those that claim that we're going to lose our Constitution are just plain ignorant of our history, and they are preventing the very mechanism the framers gave us to secure our safety and security of being used. So I ask you to please listen to the will of the voters of Maine and the American people, and please vote for HP 1232. I thank you for your time, and I'll be here for the work session if there's any further questions you may have.
Thank you. Any questions? Representative Pick?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, sir, for being here and testifying. And one of the big pushbacks on this type of thing is what's your response to someone that says if you put term limits in here, the vast amount of institutional knowledge that you lose. That's a big argument in this, and I'm not saying I agree with it, but I just want to give you a chance to talk about that.
Sure. That's a common argument I hear as well. And now we're just looking at Congress now. This is just the federal level. And I ask you, we currently have hundreds of years of institutional knowledge sitting there right now, and what has it gotten us? I would also say that that argument is cover for maintaining power and keeping the status quo. Senator Tom Coburn, who, as you may know, left Congress because of the issues, he realized he couldn't fix anything. I like what he says. It's basically due to laziness. If these folks can't look up something in archives and Google, they have 20 people working for them down in Washington, D.C. They can find the rules. If they need questions, there's a staff for that. So this institutional knowledge, in my opinion, really is just as a cover to keep power and keep the incumbents in office. And we're not even proposing a lifetime ban. We have term limits here in Maine, correct? We haven't lost institutional knowledge because people come back. We're just looking for giving other people a chance. And we're not saying that a ban would be for lifetime. And so I think you've experienced folks who have left and have come back, and there's been no drain on institutional knowledge here at all. So I would say that would apply in this amendment.
Okay. Anyone else? Representative Martin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Quinn, for your testimony. As we all know, you've been before us before. For me, the concern that I have is not whether or not Congress should have term limits. It's the Article 5 convention itself. And one of the arguments that I hear all the time is the so-called runaway convention. I've asked you this, I think, last year, a couple of years ago. Do you want to share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. The idea of the runaway convention, which was, I think, mentioned in a previous testimony, is based on a falsehood of our history. You know, this is the myth that the 1787 convention was called by Congress for the sole purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. And what happened? The delegates arrived in Philadelphia, and they ended up rewriting a brand new constitution. That's simply not true. That's a complete and utter lie. The 1787 convention was called by the state of Virginia based on the recommendation of the Annapolis Convention the year prior in 1786. The recommendation out of Annapolis was to take whatever means necessary to render the federal constitution adequate for the exigencies of the Union. That was a full authority, a full scope call. And the states sent their delegates to completely do that. So the call was made by Virginia, not Congress. The scope was a complete and open call to create a new constitution if needed. And the only two states that limited their delegates to just revising the articles were New York and Massachusetts. And New York left, which shows you that the process works. They knew they could not go beyond revising, and that's why they were bound legally by that commission, and that's why they left the convention. They didn't vote on the Constitution. And then Massachusetts. Interesting note about Massachusetts, the two delegates who did stay and signed the Constitution, when they got back home, a motion was made by that body, the Massachusetts legislature, the very body that commissioned them, whether they exceeded their authority, and it was utterly defeated. So the only body that could charge them with exceeding their authority under that commission was the legislature, and it didn't do that. It liked what the men did. Okay, so this whole idea of a runaway is a facade. It's a fear mechanism to prevent us today from using the very process the framers gave us. And why should we only allow those in Washington who are the problem of recommending solutions or amendments? It's time that we, the states, you as state legislators, Federal 85 is very clear. The amendment process, the convention mode, was given to you, the state legislators, to preserve our safety and our security. And if the federal government ever got out of control and became tyrannical and did not listen to the people, which they don't listen to us today, it is your duty to exercise this authority under Article 5. They've been promising a balanced budget amendment for 40 years. It's all lip service. That's another thing that you as state legislators could do. you are the parent of the federal government. The states are the parent. And so when you have an unruly child, what do? Do you let it continue in its ways, in the error of its ways? No, you correct it. And that's what this process is designed to do, to have the states correct the uncontrollable, the spending. There's so many things that can be addressed, but in our convention, only one thing can be addressed: term limits. It's not an open convention. 34 states must agree on the topic, and once that happens, it's bound by that topic. So all that can be addressed, and that's what makes this so great. It's a nonpartisan issue. The American people want term limits. It's black and white. There's no interpretation here. It's how many years a person can serve, and that's it. That's all we're seeking.
Representative Madden?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Quinn, are you suggesting that every time a convention has been held, and there have been few, that without exception, the purpose of the convention, that they've always stuck to that purpose, and there was never anything else discussed?
Yeah, well, based on, now let me give you an example. On the convention of states that have been held in the past, not under Article 5, but we've had about 40 of these since our founding, they never exceeded the scope of that call. So they were called for commerce issues, they were called for trade issues, they were called for things that the states were dealing with. In fact, there was two conventions of states that actually did propose amendments to our U.S. Constitution. It was in 1861 and 1814, the Hartford Convention and the Washington Peace Conference. Now, they were not official Article 5 conventions because 2/3 of the states did not apply, but those did not vary from the scope as well. So yes, I am saying that there's not been a convention among the states that has exceeded their scope of the call, that I'm aware of, unless you are.
Anyone else? Representative Madigan, and then Representative Bibi-Sella.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we send everybody down to this convention with one purpose, to deal with term limits, but I've seen it many times. What's to prevent anybody from standing up and through parliamentary rules suggest that we amend the rules to discuss whatever?
Yeah, well, first of all, the delegates who are sent, and they are appointed by you, the state legislature, are bound to the commission, and you will bind them to the topics, of course, of what Congress calls. So if Congress receives 34 applications, that's the topic. So it's going to be a term limit amendment, convention only. And also you will have authority to recall any delegates if they were to go beyond that. It's a simple matter of the chairman just overrules. There's so many safeguards involved here that the chairman can overrule anything out of order. Congress can refuse, let's say worst case scenario, something outside of a term limit amendment. First of all, I don't see how in the world it could pass in a convention where the delegates are bound to a topic. If it did, it still requires 38 states to ratify any amendment. And Congress can refuse to send any amendment that does not abide by what their call was, to send it out for ratification. So the safeguards in place are innumerous, not to mention the law, the court cases that would abound if something other than a term limit amendment came out of this. Listen, Congress has proposed 12,000 amendments. Only 33 have been ratified, 33 passed, 27 ratified. It's an extremely high bar for a ratification of an amendment to the Constitution. And we've already amended it once for term limits for the president, and I believe, and the American people believe, it's time we do the same for Congress.
Representative Bibi-Sella.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what exactly is it that binds a convention to a single topic? Is it completely in the control of the chairman?
No, it's in control of the applications. Whatever, this application that you're voting on, that binds the topic, and then when you commission, I'll give you an example. In the 1861 Washington Peace Conference, I can give you copies of it if you would like, the main commission identifies the commissioners, the delegates who were sent to that, and that was to propose an amendment to the Constitution to prevent the Civil War from breaking out. Within that commission, it said commissioners are under the control at all times to the state legislature. That's the main commission. And so you bind them legally with the commission that you provide the commissioners they can only address that topic. If you looked at New York, for instance, in 1787, they were bound to only revising the articles, and they realized this convention, even though it had the authority to go beyond that, they were limited by their Delegate Limitation Act. So that's exactly what states are doing around the country. They're writing what's called Delegate Limitation Acts to go along with any Article 5 convention that's called. And so they're all under your control here.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So we have a very polarized set of states at the moment. And so you're saying the state legislators control the convention because they control the delegates and they limit the single focus.
Exactly.
What if the states don't agree?
What do you mean, the people?
That they want an additional focus?
The people, this is not an initiative where the people get to vote on it. This is only a state legislature process.
No, I mean if the state legislators, if the state legislators decide they want more than the original focus they sent people down for.
Then they would have to apply to Congress, and they would have to get 34 states to agree to that topic. And I'll give you an example. A real-life example is if you look at the very first Article 5 application that was submitted by Virginia in 1789, it was for the Bill of Rights. This process helped prod Congress to propose the Bill of Rights. When that application came into Congress, we had James Madison, a lot of the guys who were at the convention, they were now in Congress as members, they were looking at the application and said, well, listen, we can't do anything until 2/3 of the states concur in this application. They understood that they could not call a convention until 2/3 of the states agreed on the subject. And so that just shows you that this process, there's been over 400 of these applications submitted to Congress. 400. That's a lot more than 34, right? And the reason it's never been called is because 2/3 of the states have never agreed on the subject matter. We've come close a couple times, and that just shows you that historically, practically, this process is very controlled, and that's why it's nothing to fear. It's just a meeting. It can only recommend. It can't change the Constitution, and then it still has to go back to the states. And 38 states is required before it can be part of the Constitution. Completely safe. And what's great about this convention is this is something a supermajority of the American people want. It would be absolutely political suicide if they wanted this and you gave them that. That just is illogical. It's just completely illogical. And this is the one issue that can bring both sides together because we want to see good things happen in Washington. It's not happening today. We need people to go to Washington without being all concerned about re-election and keeping the power and becoming multimillionaires in office. We need citizen legislators back in Washington, and that's exactly what term limits will help accomplish. It's not the silver bullet, folks. I understand that, but it's a good step. It's a great step in the right process, in the right direction.